Hi guys, thanks for coming out, and we'd like to welcome you to Strive's latest Mentor Q&A. For those of you who aren't familiar with Strive is personal and professional development inspired by objectivism. So one of the things we like to do is give students opportunities to interact with mentors in fields they might be interested in. I'll turn it over to Sydney to say more.
Great. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. I'd like to introduce Don, our mentor today, and just ask Don, to get us started, would you like to share a few words and just tell everyone a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, for those who don't know, I'm, like you said, Don Watkins. I'm a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and basically my job is to write and speak on the application of Ayn Rand's ideas to business and economic issues. And so kind of the catalog of stuff I've covered is broadly the issue of the morality of capitalism in my first book, Free Market Revolution, with Yaron Brook, who's the head of the Institute. I did a book on the welfare state called Roosevelt Care, and the most recent book is a work on the economic inequality debate. And so that kind of gives you a sense of the broad swath of stuff that I cover. Been doing that for about 10 years, and hopefully we'll get to talk about some of what I've learned both in getting there and then once I was at the Institute, what I've done since.
Cool. Thanks, Don. So the first question that I have for you today is, how did you get started in writing, and what single piece of advice would you give to someone who wants to do the same?
Let's see. So I got started. I mean, I was really attracted to writing from a young age, and it's hard to say whether it was because I was good at it or because I was told I was good at it. But it was something that I kind of felt efficacious in from a very young age. I remember I wrote a retrospective poem about my life when I was 6 called When I Was 5, and my dad said, "This is great, we should get it published." And that never happened. But by the time I got to high school and got really interested in philosophy, that kind of united the two things. It was a real interest in writing and a real interest in ideas. And so at that point I knew I wanted to combine those two in some form, but I really didn't know exactly how to do it. And so I went to school for a year in journalism and then realized that I was not interested or not comfortable walking up to strangers and asking them random questions, and then for various reasons left full-time college, went into the business world, and just got a business degree on the side. And so I was still committed to writing, but there was always this gap between something that seemed like, impossible, like this is just what other people do, and still wanting to do it and not knowing how to unite where I was and where I wanted to be. And frankly, I ended up getting, in many ways, lucky, which is I was taking classes from the Ayn Rand Institute, and they invited me to come write for them at a certain point, and that's what I've been doing since then. And I think I'll have things to say about how you don't have to wait around and get an email saying come work for the Ayn Rand Institute, but ways to close that gap between where you are and where you want to be, even when there's not a laid out path, or when the laid out path is not one that you want to go down for whatever reason. But if I had to reduce my advice, not just about a writing career, but any career, to one single thing, that's always really hard. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and refer everybody to a book, and that is Robert Greene's book, Mastery, which, whatever its flaws, is amazing. It's an amazing account of kind of how you achieve mastery of a given skill or a career more broadly, the set of skills needed for a career, and then how you build a successful career. And so that one step, read that book, read it again, and then execute on it, I think will get you most of where you need to go in any field.
Awesome. And so when you were beginning out on this career path and trying to figure out if it was somewhere that you would belong, is there something you found as a litmus test you might recommend to potential writers who are trying to figure out if this is really the right way for them to go?
Yeah, I have a number of things I want to say on that, because this is really, the wider question is how do you select a career. And I think the conventional advice that you get, I mean the obvious conventional advice, nobody really gives this, but it's kind of suggested to a lot of people, is that you do what brings prestige or money or something. And I think most people who are going to be on this call know that that's ridiculous. The other piece of advice, which has a lot of truth to it but I don't find particularly helpful, is follow your passion. And there's kind of two ways. One is it's just not helpful in the sense of you kind of, all right, well, I'll sit around and wait till I'm passionate about something, and that doesn't generally work. just to imagine yourself in a certain state. The way that it can actually be damaging is if you're doing something to try to figure out if it's your passion. And the question is, well, how do you assess that? Because like when you imagine something, you imagine it out of context, and it's very easy. Like if you think about somebody you're potentially, like you're looking for a dating partner, a romantic partner, and you imagine this person out of context and they're perfect, right? Like there's no problems, but every real person has a context, including things that are going to make dealing with them challenging over time. And any career, including one that you love, which is that in context, there's going to be things that you don't like. Even the stuff that's fulfilling can be really hard and stressful. And so the question is, given that fact, like what does it mean to follow your passion, or what is it, or how do you actually go about figuring out what it is that you like or that you want to do? And my general advice is that the process should be more cognitive. It's true that you want to do something that is meaningful and passionate to you, but you want to think about the why much more and have a conception of what are the characteristics of something that I would be passionate, that would be a fulfilling career. And I would say there's kind of three things that I think about in that regard. And so one is that you regard the career as good in some terms, that you think that what the career involves is something that's valuable, that is contributing to something that should be in the world. So for instance, like you might like law, but if you think that 99% of defendants are guilty and that you don't want to be getting somebody off, it might be a bad idea for you to go and be a defense attorney in criminal law just because there's good money in it, right? So you want to pick something that you think is good and important. It doesn't have to be the most important thing in the world. Like you might think, oh, philosophy is the most important, but it might not be the most important to you. But you have to see that it would be a worthwhile endeavor in terms of its results. And then the second thing is that it's going to be fulfilling to you. And the way that I think about this is just that you can use all of your resources in there, particularly your mental resources, that it's something that is fully stimulating and fully engaging to you. And kind of there's two sub-questions that I think help highlight this. Like, what are the things I'm doing when I should be doing something else? Because if you find yourself compelled to do something, it's almost certainly because you're very enthusiastic about it. It's drawing on your resources, because we generally get really bored with something if it's not drawing on our resources. And then the other, which is really a different way of coming at the same point, which is when do I feel efficacious? When do I feel like, all right, I'm in control, I'm able to do something really well? In your work, you're not always going to feel that way, but if there's activities that give you that sense, that's a good key that you're onto something right. And then the third thing I would say is you need a reality test. And this is basically, can I actually create a career out of this? Can this be something that contributes to a self-supporting life? And it may be that you think, like, if the cliche example is a musician, it may be that, well, by itself, no, but I can integrate this with a life where, I do an office job that is kind of interesting, but not my passion, and then I'm a musician on the side, and that's fine. But the point is that you have to have some sort of reality test, because a lot of people, I think, waste the chance to have a fulfilling career by being deluded in pursuing one that they're not going to be successful or that they can't be self-supporting in. And so I would say that's kind of the general way that I would think about, is this a good fit? And I think the same thing applies to writing.
Awesome. Sounds great. We have another question from Facebook. Before I go ahead and answer it, I do want to emphasize, if any of you guys have questions during the live broadcast, over on the dashboard on the side, you should see an option to submit questions. If you do that, I'll see them here and then I can ask them. I encourage you to ask your questions sooner rather than later, because what tends to happen is in the last 15 minutes, 10 people ask questions, and then we get to it. So if you have a question, ask it as soon as possible. So the next question from John is, when do you write best? And do you have a specific process or routine that you go through?
Well, as we'll probably talk about later, I'm I have tried every single system or process, and I realized that it's not the system and processes that are at fault, it's that I'm not good at following them. And so basically I just have there's two things I try. There's one thing that I naturally do, and then there's another thing that I implement consciously. So as a rule, I work better in the mornings, and before I had kids, I would wake up around 5 if I was being sluggish, 5:30 every morning, so that I could just, by the time I even got into work, I had gotten some creative big picture thinking or writing done. Today I have kids, which means that in order to do that, I wake up at 4:15. So creating a lot of morning time is important, but the really key point whenever you wake up or whenever you start working is the one self-development tip that I think is worth its weight in gold. And I actually got it from Brian Tracy, although a lot of people have come up with it, he puts it as eat that frog. It's the idea of you start your day by eating this gross frog, everything else is easy after that. And what this really translates into is that the first thing I do when I get into work, at least on good days, is I do the most important, most frightening, most challenging, the thing that I would procrastinate with. Never leave that for later in the day, because I'm going to have less energy, less willpower, less focus. And usually, not always, but usually this is some creative writing challenge for me. It's some part of the writing process where I need to be firing on all cylinders, because if it's very easy to come in and say, well, let me just check email, and then that can just snowball out of control. So if I'm going to check email, it's going to be sometime between when I leave the house and when I get to work. But once I'm at work, it's definitely jump in with the most challenging thing. Now, the one exception to this, and this is kind of like if I say what is my working system, is that I'm very inefficient, but I'm very productive. And the way that works is that if I get really obsessed about something, my general compulsiveness can allow me to work, insanely long, hard, and fast on it. And so, when I'm writing my books, I don't particularly need a system, because I find myself leaping out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning because I'm excited to get to the page, and then I look up and it's 5 o'clock and time to go home in the afternoon, and then I'll get home and want to work on it more. So, that's definitely not going to work for everybody, and in some ways there's drawbacks to it, but that's kind of like my own particular system, and in terms of quantity of content, it's definitely worked. Quality, I'll let people judge for themselves.
Okay, awesome. So we have another live question. This one is from Haleli. And Haleli asks, going back to passion, so do you suggest not trying if your passion is something like singing or dancing, for example, if you deem it unlikely to be a good way to earn a living? Or as a young person, should we give it our all? Should we give it all our might just to ensure we're not giving up without trying and missing out on a chance that would help?
These questions are really hard to answer in the abstract. I mean, definitely you don't just sit down and go, well, it's very unlikely to be successful in this realm. I mean, I do think in a sense you should give it a go, but part of the reality test is, and this is the biggest point I want to talk about as we go later on, is that I think it's really critical in any field to have mentors and models. I think that's the #1 learning tactic in terms of career. And so what you should have if you want to enter a career like singing or whatever is you should find somebody who's a trusted mentor, which means somebody who's actually done what you want to do, or at least has a proven track record of knowledge in that world. And then you want to cultivate a relationship where you can learn from them. And one of the things you should be seeking really early on from people you trust is, am I fooling myself? And you have to be careful here. You want to make sure that it's a trusted mentor, because a lot of people are going to naysay you if you're trying to do anything out of the ordinary. And then part of the trust is, do they have an incentive to fool me? Because if it's my trusted mentor is my manager who I'm paying money to for whatever reason, yeah, that can be kind of a conflict of interest in terms of being honest with you. And even if they say definitely you just don't have what it takes, that doesn't necessarily mean you should take it right away, take that advice and quit, but you need to take that seriously, and you need to be thinking about, let me give you an analogy of how I think about it. In investing, if you talk to hedge fund managers, what a lot of them do is they have a certain hypothesis about what's going to happen in the market. And they say, if my hypothesis is right, the price shouldn't go below X or it shouldn't go above Y. And then if it does, I have to drop my hypothesis. And yeah, you can invent a story, well, maybe I'm right and it's just not working out. But if you want to be successful, no, you have to have a hypothesis and say, if X does or doesn't happen, then my decision is going to go the other way. And I think if you're pursuing a career like, you know, singing or something where the chances of success are very slim, and your goal is actual success, it's not the guy who just does it in the evening like I was talking about before. Existential success, I mean, financial and popularity. Then you need to have some sort of standard, in which case you say, like, you know, and you can even hear stars do it. They'll say, oh, you know, my dad gave me a year, or I gave myself 5 years to make it, or something like that. You need to have some sort of thing like that that is set in advance, I think, and then you give it your all, and then at a certain point, if you don't think it's realistic, then you can adapt. But I think the mistake people make is just playing it by ear and not taking any feedback seriously, either feedback from trusted mentors or feedback from the market. And that kind of self-delusion, I mean, this was really what American Idol was all about, is trying to peel away people from their self-delusions.
Got it. I have a question then for you. So, like, to some point, what you're saying, right, is to listen to mentors and to heed people's advice, or at least to hear it and think critically about it. But by the same token, there are naysayers out there, and there are people and standards that everybody kind of expects you to conform to that you may actually be better off if you break out of it. How do you know when to take people's advice, and what do you do when you feel pressure to conform to conventional ideas?
There's a couple questions wrapped in there. I mean, just on the more concrete thing is, like, that's why you need to, A, choose your mentors and advisors very carefully, and then B, as you suggested in part of your question, it's not just like you take them blindly. It's that they'll have certain reasons, and you can first-handly evaluate those reasons. They say, look, you know, you're not good for X, Y, and Z, and you can think about, does that make sense? Is that something I can work on? So it's not just like you're listening to somebody and taking it on faith. That definitely would be a mistake. And there are some cases, and there's really not much you can say about this, about the people who everybody tells them that they're wrong, and then they turn out to be right, and often they're really innovative people. And at the end of the day, like, if you think you're one of those people, then nothing I'm going to say can or should dissuade you, and you can just go about it, and, you know, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. But for people who actually want, you know, some advice on it, I think that's how you have to approach it. In terms of kind of conforming to conventional opinions, I'm probably not the best person to ask. So when I was younger, and, you know, I became an objectivist when I was 15. I became an atheist at 14, and these were never popular ideas. But that never bothered me the least. In fact, it was much more the opposite, which was, you know, I was never the super popular kid. I was definitely not the nerdiest kid, but it wasn't like I had a gazillion friends that I would have had if I had more popular ideas. And so I think what it really gave me was more, I was always kind of proud of my intelligence, and this was kind of, okay, I have a secret, like I have the truth and these people don't. And so there's kind of a sense of superiority, which is dangerous if you don't have intellectual honesty. And thankfully I had that, and so I was willing to, you know, learn and admit when I was wrong, and wasn't too stuck up about it. But it also gives you a certain courage. I would say, actually, if anything, this is something that has become harder as I've gotten older, and it's not so much more that, like, I'm tempted to conform to other people's opinions as much as it's, you know, it's uncomfortable to make somebody feel bad about themselves or to create tension by disagreeing, and it's not really a temptation to, like, pretend that my ideas are other than they are, but it's easy to emphasize areas of agreement and downplay areas of disagreement. And there, it's just, you have to put concern for the, and by the way, I'm not presenting that as like a quality you should cultivate. That's one that I'm trying to decultivate. But if you have that, it just has to be that your hierarchy has to be, nothing is more important than truth. Like, so it doesn't matter how comfortable or uncomfortable I feel, or how much fear I feel, or how much it's, you know, feels good to be liked. Just what my allegiance is number one to what's true, and like that solves that solves that problem.
Okay, awesome. So do you have any advice for somebody who wants to start a blog to showcase their own writing? Anything that you've learned from your experience?
Yeah, do it. Um, so this will probably come up. Let me see if it makes sense to go into now. Hold on, I have some notes, so because there's so much to cover, but let's see. Yeah, well, let me use this as an opportunity to go into a wider issue. Yeah, my advice is that, like, if you want to be a writer, start writing, and blogs are a really good way where nobody can stop you from publishing. So I'm very much for it. But the wider question is, all right, you have a goal, you want to be a writer, and more widely, like any career, you have to think about, all right, how do I get there? And a lot of the questions, I think, are kind of tactical, right? It's like, well, should I start a blog, or should I go try to take a class, or should I work at this company? And I think you need to think much more about with any career. So the starting point of thinking about any career, and it is, and this is the starting point for a lot of things in the productive realm, probably the romantic realm too, is that nobody cares about you. It's not that they hate you, it's just that, like, everybody's focused on their own values, and insofar as they don't already know you, their concern is what their interests are, and that's proper. And so you have to actually make them care, and the fact that you happen to write something or it does not make anybody else have any desire to read it. It doesn't. Just because you think you'd be really good or want a career in a certain realm doesn't mean that anybody else is going to jump to give you a chance or to help you. And so you need to take seriously this idea they don't care about me, and then say, okay, well, what's required then in order to do what I want to do? And I would break things down in a few ways. The best career advice, I think, comes from a really undervalued philosopher, Steve Martin, the actor and comedian, whose major career advice was be so good they can't ignore you. Like, you can't, at the end of the day, nothing matters if you don't have ability, and if you have ability, nothing else matters. Like, that's really the sine qua non. Like, that's really what it's all about. And we can talk about how to become so good they can't ignore you. I think there's a lot to say about that. The second thing I would say is to be distinctively valuable. I think, it's, I read a lot of people who say in the free market economics side of things, and they can even be clear writers, but basically it's the same arguments that you've heard 1,000 times, often with the same examples, maybe just applied to the latest journalistic headline. And if you do that, then you're not adding value, you're not standing out, and so there's no reason for people to be interested in what you have to say, because they can just read somebody who's like much more, knows a lot much more, making the same point probably much more eloquently, or at least who's already built quite a following for themselves. And then finally, I would say, be obsessively focused on the customer, thinking about customer broadly. So you're engaged in a trade whenever you are trying to get a career, whether it's an employer, whether it's your audience as a writer, whether it's somebody who you want to publish you, anything you're dealing with who you can think of as a customer, and you really need to put yourself in their shoes and think, all right, what are they looking for? What are the problems that they're struggling with? What would make me clear? What would make it clear to them that I have a value to offer them? And so Ayn Rand has this thing called the trader principle, which is that when we deal with others, it should be win-win. And there's one level of that is simply that you shouldn't take advantage of other people. But the deeper point there is that you should always be thinking of how both sides win, that it should be of a selfish concern to you. How is the other side benefiting? And I want to make sure the other side's benefiting. And particularly if you're talking about a long-term relationship like a potential employer or an actual employer, like that should be constantly part of your thought process. And so I think if you're thinking then about writing, that is any career, those are kind of the key parts. And then with writing, there's a ton of just more specific advice. I mean, obviously read and write a lot, and blogging is really good for that, right? I think that's kind of obvious. I would say definitely develop deep knowledge beyond just philosophy. So insofar as you come to writing because you want to talk about ideas, particularly if they're ideas inspired by Ayn Rand, the more you know about specific things, the much more powerful your writing will be. Most of the, I shouldn't say most, I had a lot of struggles, particularly in my first couple of years at ARI, and a lot of it was based on the fact that I just didn't, I'd been so focused on philosophy itself that I was deficient in my understanding of a lot of concrete things, whether it be history or economics or particular lines of business. Or there's just so much that if I had had that knowledge, I would have been way more successful way earlier, because it's hard to write under the best of circumstances. It's very hard if you're writing from a perspective that people don't know and disagree with here, and it's super, super hard to do it if you don't know any facts. So
Yeah.
that's really valuable. And then, in particular, one aspect that's neglected is you should know the cultural context. Like, what do people who don't agree with me think? And above all, what do my intellectual opponents think? If you write in the economics world and you don't read Paul Krugman at least occasionally and know his essential views, like you don't know enough to write. Like, that is, you have to know the other side's argument, because one of the key things that, to the extent my books are persuasive, I think one of the things that makes them persuasive, particularly the latest one, Equals Unfair, is that we lay out the other side's case, I think, clearer and more strongly and effectively than even they do, and then dismantle it. And there's this idea that comes from marketing, which is if you name the customer's problem in terms clearer than they can to themselves, they automatically assume you have the solution. And there's a real truth to that in persuasive writing. If you can make the case you're going to dismantle really clearly and strongly, then people are going to be much more willing to follow your answer. Whereas if they get any hint of a straw man, that's a complete turnoff. Let's see if there's anything else I would add to that. Yeah, I mean, the last thing is just, and all of these really come under the umbrella of being super clear about the truth. If most writing problems are really thinking problems, and so, like, you really, really need to know what's true, and to the extent that you're not clear on something, it's going to show up very, very vividly in the ineffectiveness of your writing.
Okay. I have just a quick follow-up. Going back to the customer focus thing you said, what are some best practices that you use to really get in touch with the customer's mindset? Like, to really ensure that what you're doing does provide value to them. What are, like, the specific concrete things you do to go about that?
I mean, this is a good example where I think there's really systematic ways to do it, like questions you should ask yourself. I think Alex Epstein might have even talked about this a little at his Strive Q&A, but there's a marketer that we really like, Eben Pagan, who has this list of questions that you use to form what he calls a customer avatar, and that's really valuable. I'm not usually that structured about it, but basically it's just I spend a lot of time getting to know the customer in one way or another, and that can be talking to people, reading things, and just paying attention. So a lot of times my customer is what you might call like the general reader, right? Like, it's a person in the culture who's not already convinced of free market ideas, or at least not fully convinced. They've heard all these things that show up in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and on in an average college campus. And so just reading widely and talking to people, you get to know that context quite well. And as you talk with them or write something, you're going to get feedback, and often it's going to be feedback that says, well, what about this argument? Or I don't that doesn't make any sense, or you must be saying why, when in fact you're thinking, oh, I was saying something completely different. So it's being embedded in the world, and then if there's kind of a more specific person or world that you need to get to know, right now, for instance, Yaron, Brooke, and I are doing some stuff in finance. And there, I mean, I'm doing a lot of different things. One is just reading a lot. Two is reading every podcast where they're interviewing people in the industry. And then three is just we have a list of about 20, 30 people in the industry that I'm going to sit down and interview in depth to get to know the world, to get to know how they think about different things. So there's a lot of different things you do, but at the end of the day, it's simple. It's just you think about, like, how do I get to know what my friend wants for his birthday? It's, well, I spend a lot of time with my friend, and we talk about the things we like and dislike. And this is really just that. It's that you value somebody, and so you pay attention to their values and disvalues, their knowledge and lack of knowledge, what they know, what they don't know, what they are uncertain about. Like, it's just paying attention and exposing yourself to that data.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. So how has your view of success, or has your view of success changed over the years from when you began on this career path to where you are now? When you began, what did you envision as sort of like your purpose, your ultimate goal, or something that you wanted to achieve, and what does that look like today?
That's a really interesting question. It has definitely changed quite a bit. So I think when I was younger, I just wanted to be able to write. Like if I could put food in my mouth or on the table, writing about ideas, particularly Ayn Rand's ideas, that was the ultimate. And then like if you had told my 15-year-old self that, oh, guess what, you're going to get to go to the Ayn Rand Institute, work with Yaron Brook, Alex Epstein, Onkar Ghate, and co-write books with Yaron, and make bestsellers lists and talk on Capitol, like that was just beyond my view of what was even possible when I was younger. And then like getting those things, it made me realize, all right, what really is the goal here? And is it to become really famous? Is it to change the culture? And all of these things may or may not be components of the goal. But the part of what I realized about myself is that those aren't my primary motivations. That my primary motivation is really what I regard as success is, yes, to be able to put food on the table writing, but I think about it in even a more narrow way, which is that what is important to me in life is I like finding subjects that are interesting to me, and then I get really frustrated when they're hard to learn, when the answers are hard to come by, when things are not explained really clearly. And so I like writing the books that I would have wanted to read when I first came to that field. So I became very interested in capitalism, but I could never find a book that just explained the whole, it laid out laissez-faire, including all the examples I would need and some of the objections I encountered that really worked out, some bromides that were thrown out by free market economists that really laid it out simply. And so that's why one of the reasons I worked with Yaron on Free Market Revolution, our first book. With Roosevelt Care, my second book, it all came from the frustration of I found it really hard to argue against the welfare state, in part because one of the key things you would want to know is, well, what was America like before we had a welfare state? And yet there was nothing written on that that was any good. There were pieces here and there, but nothing that had really put it all together. And so I went and wrote that book. And then with Equals Unfair, it's the same thing. Here's this inequality debate, and it was really hard to figure out what were the issues, what were people debating about. I heard all sorts of statistics, like which one should I be listening to and how should I think about that? And so just putting that all together. And then now I said that Yaron and I are working in finance, like that's a whole other realm where like there's a lot of good research and writing that's been done, but it's really, most of it's really hard. It's all over the place. None of it comes from the right context and the right methods. I shouldn't say none of it. Particularly in the free banking realm, people like George Selgin and Larry White and Kevin Dowd have done amazing work. But but nothing that's really made it that you could step in day one, read one book, and really know how to think clearly about it and have all the knowledge that you need to at least have a basic view of the issue. And so for me, that's what success is. Success is being able to constantly find areas that are compellingly exciting to me, and then writing the books that I wish I had been able to read when I first got started.
Okay.
And then, you know, cultural change, keep the country free, like make money, all that's nice. But personally, that is secondary to me.
Okay, awesome. So now I want to go ahead and jump over just a bit to the process side of things of writing. What would you say is one key guiding principle you followed that's helped you achieve success in writing? And just in general as well.
Just in general in writing? I mean, so I would say that the number one thing that has helped, this is a good chance to go into the point about mentors and models more. The number one thing that I've benefited from is spotting people who are really, really good and then learning from them. And so I put it as mentors and models. And you can think about a model as anybody who does what you want to do and does it really well. And you may know them, you may not know them, they may be dead, but you can just gain the benefit of learning both from their work directly, and then often, hopefully, they've commented about how they do what they do, and that can be really valuable. And then mentors are generally, not always, but generally models, but who will give you individualized feedback to help you spot in your own self areas where you can improve. What are the mistakes that you're making? Because gaining feedback is really, really critical when you're trying to build a skill, because it's very easy to do things wrong and not know that you're doing things wrong, or it's very easy to struggle with something, a problem that somebody's already solved in the past and you just didn't know it, who's figured out kind of shortcuts. And to the extent that that I've been successful, I would say almost, it's impossible to quantify these things, but well over 50% of that is that I've had the good fortune to work and learn some really amazing people. I mentioned, Iran, Onkar, but number one for me was Alex Epstein, who now runs the Center for Industrial Progress, but used to work at the Ayn Rand Institute when I first worked there. And Alex was somebody who I very early on recognized was doing writing in the way that I thought, like, if I could do that, that would be amazing. And so I made it a point, even though there was nothing official about it, to just constantly go to him and ask for advice, ask for feedback. And I took it very seriously. And part of the keys about feedback, and if you have a good mentor, getting feedback should feel bad, at least a little bit, a lot of the time, because they're going to be telling you things that you are not doing well, and if they're not being really critical and honest about it, you've not found a good mentor. And then I had the even better fortune of Alex needing people to move into the house that he lives, so I was able to corner my mentor much more than most people do. But you need to find that in some form, I think, for most careers, and certainly it is super helpful for any intellectual and communicative career. And if there's one thing you can do, it's like that's the one thing I would recommend to people. And I mentioned the book Mastery by Robert Greene, and he has a lot to say about mentorship, about how to find them, about like how to actually make it worth their while. And the number one thing I would say in terms of how to do it is, it's usually not generally the right thing to walk up and say, hey, be my mentor. The simplest piece of advice that's really valuable is, if anybody's at all successful, what inevitably happens is that people ask you, hey, I want to be a writer, what should I do? And then you tell them, or you answer some kind of specific question about that, and then you never hear from them again. What almost never happens is that somebody takes your advice, puts into action. So if you actually want to get ongoing feedback from somebody, ask them a pretty low bandwidth question, one that's not like, hey, what are the 20 steps to achieving a career? Like, ask for something specific that they can answer very briefly. then go put into action, tell them the results, and then you can follow up with another question. You should be taking up relatively small amounts of their time, and you shouldn't be asking them things that they've already answered in other forums. So if they've written a book on how to become a writer and you're asking them, how should I become a writer, you've already made a mistake. Like, you need to show that you've put in the work and you're going beyond it. And often I think people, when they look at younger people, they want to help them, and one of the number one things that you look for is this person valuable for me to invest my time with, is the quality of the questions they ask. If somebody asks a question to me that reflects that they've paid attention to my work and that they're really thinking about things beyond the kind of like, well, I was too lazy to read a Wikipedia page, so I'll just ask Don, like, that's exciting to me. And then if they actually act on it and then come back and tell me the results, then that's somebody who I'm going to be interested to invest in. And I mean, and like, you shouldn't, if you do that, you should not feel that somehow you're asking for something for nothing, because the fact is that there's a handful of people who have done that with me, and those people, I welcome their interruptions. Like, I will stop, even something that's kind of important that I'm doing, if they come up and ask for a question, just because seeing them succeed is really exciting for me, and the issues that they raise are inevitably exciting. So be a good mentee is the key to getting a good mentor.
Okay.
I think it's a really important thing to mention, because I hear a lot of young people who are concerned to ask mentors to mentor them because they don't want to be burdens, because they feel like it's not a win-win relationship. So I think it's nice for our audience to hear that mentors actually enjoy what they're doing when they're with the right mentee.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to remember, everybody successful started where you are in one way or another. Maybe behind you, maybe ahead of you, but they started roughly where you are. And one of their big motivations, one of the big rewards of success is to be able to spot potential and help it succeed. I mentioned that, like, the core of what I think about success is writing the books that I wish had been there when I was young. A lot of, I think, what successful people want to do in the world is promote people who were like them when they were getting started, or they want to, in effect, solve the problems that they faced along the way. And so you're offering them a tremendous value, particularly if you go on to do great work. I mean, just from an investment perspective, if I can help somebody who's going to be, doing great work in the future, like Alex has made this point about me, so I'm not, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm tooting my own horn a bit, but it's like, he spent maybe in total, let's say 20 hours of pure kind of just mentorship feedback, maybe more than that, right? But it wasn't like an insane amount of investment of time, and yet part of the result has been that has been all the work that I've put out to whatever extent that's valuable. And I think it's been, definitely valuable on some level. And so, like, that's a great return for your time if your goal is to have an effect in the world. And I think that's true in other fields as well. If you're in the sciences or something like that, a scientist wants to see good work done, and if he can, by investing in you, can see 30 studies or one great breakthrough, like that's like buying a penny stock and it becoming Apple.
So I have a question. You mentioned that a good mentor will provide like criticism type of feedback, or like suggestions of what you could do better or what you haven't been doing well. And I'm curious, as a mentee, how do you accept that gracefully instead of becoming defensive? And then even once you're in your career, like for you specifically, your books must get some critics. How do you sort of handle that?
Well, it's never fun like that. So that's a starting point. I mean, maybe some people it literally doesn't bother them at all. I never enjoyed getting feedback, and there probably were a couple occasions along the way where, at least in the initial moment, I got a little defensive. Although I don't think that happened too much, if at all. But the number one thing is don't. Like, that is a no-no. The whole premise here is that you have a lot to learn, and you're going to people that you respect for their knowledge. And if you have an ounce of defensiveness, then they are very likely to have the reaction of, well, what am I doing here? If you don't need my advice, I don't need you. Like this, this is not a debating relationship. So the whole starting premise should be, I know I'm, have a ton to learn, and I know this person knows way more than I do, and so my goal is to just listen. If I knew better, then I wouldn't need to take up any of their time. The other is just you never take it personally, and I think a lot of the best mentors are good at depersonalizing it. It's always about the material. There's a book by Ed Catmull who runs Pixar, and he talks about the way they set up their kind of creative feedback sessions where you're going to be insanely critical about the piece, but it's all about the piece and about how to make it better. It's never about the person and their ability. And you just remember that this is all, it's criticism of your performance at a given time. It's performance of a piece that you wrote at a certain time. It's not about you. And if you do have a mentor who's making it about you, then, unless they're like the person of the ages that you're willing to accept that for because there's nobody like them, you probably should find a different one. And and so I think, the more that's the dynamic, the better. The more that you can just, but I would say if there's those moments where it feels really painful or whatever, you just have to think about that, like, okay, this is the price. This is a price, and I'm paying it. Why? Because I actually want to be successful. I want to be able to do good work, and so if I have to feel like, I've gotten a few bumps and bruises, and believe me, I've gotten more bumps and bruises than probably anybody you'll ever meet, because most of what I produced for the first couple of years at ARI was garbage for all sorts of reasons, but it's totally worth it to go through that process. So yeah, I mean, there's not a lot to say about it, even though that's a roundabout way of saying there's not a lot to say about it, except that you just have to endure it. It's not about you. It's about solving a problem that's there.
That's a helpful distinction to make.
So next question, if you had to apply the 80-20 principle to writing, that 20% of the work or 20% of the effort is going to give 80% of the results, what would you say that is in writing?
I think what I'm about to say is right. I don't know how useful it's going to be, but it's clarity about what's right, about what's true. As I mentioned, most writing problems are really thinking problems. Most of the reason that people go wrong. So writing, what is writing? It's not putting words on a page. It is communication. It's an act of communicating from one mind to another. And the precondition of communication is that you be clear on what's right. And there can be communication problems, and it can be, oh, I don't really know my audience, or I'm having difficulty structuring this. I don't know how to make this point first and this point second, or I need a good story to keep this interesting and I don't know how to find one. Those are relatively easy things to solve once you have some experience writing. But the hardest point is always just, what is the truth? And not just like what's the true conclusion, but how exactly do you formulate it? Like, what are the logical steps that lead up to it? What are the flaws and the arguments on the other side? Like, that is the really hard work. And if you get that right, that's I mean, you're literally 80% of the way there. But it's hard to call that 80-20, because in general in 80-20, it's the 20% of the effort that gives you 80% of the results. But this is kind of like the 90% of the effort that gives you 80% of the results. So this might be a violation of the 80-20 rule if you come right down to it.
So what would be the most challenging part of learning to write for you? Like, is there something, I know you've mentioned some stuff that you grappled with at the beginning at ARI, but even when you first began writing, like even at 6 years old, right, when you were writing poetry, was there a certain aspect of writing that always troubled you?
My challenge, at least before I came to ARI and I became aware of kind of where some other weak spots were, I think the difficulty that I had, and these two things are related, is that it became too easy to me, and I didn't have any mentors, with one exception, that really challenged me and helped me improve. The one exception is I had in high school, I joined the high school newspaper, and Brooke Nelson, who had actually been a former Washington Post reporter, so she knew what she was doing. She's the only teacher in my whole life who I would say was an actual influence on me, and she's the only one I keep in touch with either. And I remember the first time I had got something back from her, it was this is a cliche among writers, but it's, you got something back and there's more red on it than black. And she was the only person who kind of brought me up a notch. But in general, the problem was that I was so much better just, quote, naturally than other people. In other words, I could put coherent sentences together and I could think abstractly, so I could say stuff that was, more intelligent than your average person. It came really easy, and this was actually one of the problems I had with learning philosophy too, is that it came too easy. And a lot of what happens to people who are young and things come very easy is that you start to build your self-image around being good at something, and it's very easy then to become resistant to feedback, because suddenly now I'm a great writer, or I'm somebody who knows objectivism. That's threatened, and then you stagnate. And I think this happens. Talented young people are prone to it, but very, very often you see it on people who will be good when they're young, and then they stagnate once they reach kind of a certain level of success, because then they get their self-image. Like when I'm young, I know, all right, I have nothing to lose, and I'll take feedback and I'll learn. But then once I gain a certain status, then it's kind of like I have to be the brilliant person who gets everything right. And so in order to never stagnate, you have to never stop viewing yourself as a student, as somebody who's constantly learning. And so for me, it was one of the best experiences I had. I got to ARI, and I already very quickly got a hint that, all right, I have a lot more to learn. But one memory in particular stands out, which is I was we have a program called the Objectivist Academic Center, which educates people who want to learn more about Ayn Rand's philosophy and how to communicate it. And I wrote a paper for ONCAR in philosophy about, I think this one was about free will. It was about free will. And I was so proud of it. I worked so hard on that paper, and I wanted to impress him, and I just arrived at ARI, and I had read everything and listened to everything that had been, officially out from objectivists on the issue of free will. So, I wasn't going to make any day one mistakes, or so I thought. But he gave me a C, and he was being generous, and he just tore it apart in his friendly ONCAR way. And that was kind of a life-changing experience, and I felt disheartened for about 10 seconds, and then I realized, a whole new world opened up, because I realized this is exciting. There's so much more to learn. This is such an opportunity to grow. And then there were specific things he said that gave me a clue as to what I needed to do and where my mistakes were coming from. And then, from there it took probably 2 years to even start to really from there it was probably 2 years before I'd consider myself really a writer, and then it wasn't until I wrote Free Market Revolution that I felt fully mature and in control of myself as a thinker and a writer. But even since then, it's been critical to never lose that perspective that there's a lot of ways I can improve, and there it helps just to be surrounded by people who are better than you. There's kind of a saying, it's a cliche one, but it's quite good, which is that you never want to be the smartest person in the room. The trouble with that saying is that most of the people who think they're the smartest person in the room seldom are, so it's somewhat paradoxical. But in general, surround yourself with really smart people is helpful in anything.
Okay, awesome. So we have a few more live questions now.
In the last, how much more time do we have?
We have 6 more minutes. So
people are breaking your rules. I can stay on a few minutes longer if you guys can too. So.
Okay, cool. So we have one from John. How do you decide which issues to focus on?
Thankfully, I have a job that gives me a lot of flexibility there. There's nobody telling me write about X. it's really whatever I'm interested in. But part of what is interesting to me is not just like it happens to make me feel a certain emotion, but I see it as important in a certain way. So like the inequality book, I mean, it really came about because I've always been interested in human ability, and I view most of my books as and my work as helping people appreciate Bill Gates in the same way they appreciate a LeBron James. But you know, Ron and I had this conversation where he was going on this rant about this book on inequality by an economist named Thomas Piketty, and we both agreed on like how important this issue was going to be. And I said somebody should write a book about it. And then I kind of looked at him and said, "Oh, damn," because clearly the only people who are going to write it are going to be us. And but it was chosen from that perspective. It was in the context of my my purpose, which is defending ability and the freedom for ability to function. And then it was, I saw this issue as important, and then there's a lot of intriguing stuff about the issue. I like issues that cover a lot of territory. So I've become interested in finance, for instance, because it covers finance proper, it covers money and banking, macroeconomics, it covers psychology in many ways, like history, it touches everything, political philosophy, and the inequality debate too. And so I like things that take a lot of areas and bring them together. So I mean, part of my background or my particular unique focus is I'm not an academic or a scholar. I view myself as a popularizer of ideas. That doesn't mean I don't add my own spin or don't add to things, but a lot of what I'm doing is synthesizing stuff that is written at a really complex, detailed, scholarly level and trying to make it interesting and understandable to the public. And so areas where I can do that, where it's interdisciplinary and where it's important, that's kind of like the gold mine for me. And so I just look around for stuff like that, and then when I find it, I let obsession and compulsiveness take over, and it turns out pretty well generally.
Awesome. We have another live question from William. Do you have any plans for a new book in the near future?
So for me, the hard part is not writing a book. It's not writing a book. My natural inclination is to just start writing the next one as soon as I finish the last one. But for various reasons, that's not the ideal scenario. And so I was really committed after Equals Unfair to just spend a lot of time focusing on promoting that one. And I haven't dropped that at all. But Yaron and I are working on something that's half a collection of existing material, half roughly new material, in the line of, we've started putting out collections on free speech and one on foreign policy. So this will be one on finance, hopefully next year. It won't be a full-scale book like Equals Unfair, but there will be a lot of new material in it. So that's the plan right now anyway, and we're working on that as we speak. Nobody else knows that though, so keep it quiet.
Don, I did want to give you the chance also. Is there anything that we didn't get to touch on yet that you'd like to share with the audience? I mean, no pressure if not, but if there's something that you wanted to get across.
I think we covered, I mean, these were great questions, so I think we covered most of what I want to say. Yeah, I mean, nothing is jumping out at me right now.
Okay, cool. Well, then so for anyone who's questioned, we had a lot on the list today. If you still have questions for Don, or if there's anything that comes up for you in the next few days, Don has kindly offered that you can email him at dwatkins@aynrand.org, and I'll post that email for you guys in the Facebook event group so that you can find it there.
Awesome. And one other thing we definitely want to mention, the fall conference that last year was StriveCon, this year is going to be Ayn Rand Con. It's going to be November 4th through the 6th, and it's going to be in Atlanta, Georgia. The sign-up page for that just went live 2 or 3 days ago. If you just search Ayn Rand Con, it should come up. Applications are due by October 10th, so that leaves you just under a month to get it in. For students that are scholarships, we definitely encourage you to apply. The title of the conference is Live Free and Thrive, And so it's going to be on free will as it applies. There's numerous different areas of life.
Sure. And that conference will be in collaboration with Strive, so you'll be able to attend some Strive events towards the end, and we'll definitely be there to talk with you.
Yeah.
And then one other thing I'd like to share, so we have our next Mentor Q&A coming up October 19th, and that's going to be with Caitlin McBride. So she's a program director at Notre Dame Law School, so you can look out for her emails and some more information about that in the coming weeks.
Yeah. And so, yeah, we'd like to, Don, thank you very much for coming out. We really appreciate it. And everybody who attended, thank you for coming out also. We have a recording of this. We'll get that put up shortly so that you guys can come back, revisit it, listen to what you want to. But yeah, thanks everybody, and until next time.
All right. Thank you, Don.
Hey, thanks, guys.